Happy Armageddon, everybody. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at your images that you guys sent me to critique and review. You sent me like 500 emails, which is a little bit overwhelming. Luckily, I started a special email just for that. If you have not yet sent me an image for review and you would like to do so, you can do that at SENDNICKPHOTOS@gmail.com. So in today's video, I'm going to try to handpick some images that I feel like would be relevant to other people watching, because I'm obviously not going to get through them all. But what I am going to do is try to spend a little bit of time on each image and talk about what I feel that person could have done to make the image better. So I hope you guys are making the most out of the gift that a lot of us have been given, meaning spare time. A lot of us don't have a lot of spare time in our lives, and hopefully you guys are using it well. I personally have been using it to get caught up on some editing for the F4 project. This stuff looks like frosted donuts or something.
Chocolate donut. So we're just gonna have ourselves a chocolate brownie with icing on.
Doesn't this look delicious?
Oh, I really want to eat it. It looks like it'll be sweet and crunchy. Oh, you did it! He did it! Oh God, you idiot! Oh, that's like poisonous.
It's not poison, is it?
Yeah, it's not arsenic.
Is it?
Yeah.
The F4 project is coming along nicely. I'm excited about some news that'll be coming out pretty soon, actually, about that. So stay tuned for that. Let's jump into today's video and let's jump into some of these image reviews. So this first shot was sent to me by Jacob. Interesting shot. There's definitely some things that I like about it. I like that it has nice layers, and I do love it anytime that the main subject is the brightest thing in the shot. I talk a lot about that. And in this case, we have that nice, dark, stormy background, yet we have these nice, bright, high-textured waves. So I really like the kind of layering that's happening in this shot. But what I don't really care for is kind of the, I guess the framing of the shot. First of all, when you're photographing these wave images and wave splashes, you need to make sure that the kind of the apex of the moment, or the apex of the wave, which in this case is going to be this highest part of the splash, you want to make sure that you're not cropping that off. In this case, we've cropped off just that little bit. Also, as I look at this, I feel like the action that's happening to the right, on the right side of the frame, is the most interesting part of the shot, or of the splash. I'd like to see a frame where it's a little bit more centered in the shot. Feels like a lot of the interest is off to the right of the frame. I do like how you're using the flatter, more calm water as a kind of a framing, bottom frame for the shot. I would just like to see the action, the action part of the shot a little bit more centered. This particular composition feels a little bit lopsided, a little bit heavy on the right. But I do like what you've done in post-processing. You've managed saturation well, so it's not too oversaturated. It's more about the textures. I do like the shutter speed choice. Shutter speed choice is excellent. It's just about framing that moment in a little bit better way. So this is a pretty interesting composition, and I definitely like the choice to go black and white on this particular shot. The reason I like black and white for this is because you have these very distinct tonal layers. You have a bright layer on the bottom, followed by this kind of triangular dark layer, followed by the mountain, followed by the sky. So I like the choice to go black and white here. I think compositionally, though, there's a more sky than needed, if that makes sense. I would actually crop down on the shot just a little bit and eliminate some of that empty sky that really isn't adding to the shot. If you look at this top right corner where the dark triangular shape meets the sky, maybe that would be pretty close to a good place to crop from the top. So post-processing wise, like I said, I do like the choice to go black and white here because it really emphasizes the difference in tone. But there's some post-processing issues I see. First of all, we have a halo appearing around the edge of that mountain. So it's kind of obvious in this case that you've made a selection of the sky, probably with a quick select tool or something, and brought the exposure down of that sky, and you probably over darkened it, in my opinion. If you compare how dark the blue portion of the sky, or the black portion of the sky is, compared to the shadows on the mountain, they're unnaturally dark. So something that you could do to make it look a little bit more natural is maybe brighten the sky just a little bit. Don't darken it quite so much. Really keep an eye on the halos that are being created. You need to make sure you go in and refine that edge when you're making that selection of the sky, or use a luminosity mask to target those halos that are being created. I also have a video, I'll link to it right here, where you can go in and remove halos in Photoshop. But I think by darkening the mountain and brightening the sky just a little bit, that's going to do two things. It's going to make the sky look the proper exposure when compared to the mountain, so it'll have a more natural look. But it's also going to draw attention to the highlight that is happening up on the peak of that mountain. So the light that is happening on that peak, it's going to be even more impactful if the brightness of that mountain is just brought down just a little bit. Remember, without shadows, highlights have no impact. And you've done a good job of, making the image overall fairly dark, so those highlights do still have an impact. But by bringing down the exposure of the mountain, and especially the shadow areas of that mountain, is going to make that area where the light is hitting more impactful. So this next shot is a great example of how shutter speed choice when you're shooting seascapes can really impact the feel and the mood of a shot and the energy of a shot. So this shot looks like it's probably shot at like 1 second, maybe even a tiny bit longer than that. And what that longer shutter speed does is it obviously blurs out the moving water more, but it also makes the static parts of the image, like the thing with the life preserver on it, whatever that is, the life preserver holder thingamajiggy, and the rocks, it makes those more contrasty and stand out even more because they're a static part of the shot. Compositionally, I like the layout of the rocks and the life preserver thing and the rocks in the and the sea stacks in the background. I like the way that this foreground rock kind of leads your eye back to that life preserver holder, which kind of leads you into the right side of the frame. But then the sea stacks balance it out by being on the left side of the frame. So it's a nice balanced image. I'm not sure that the sky or the amount of sky is really adding a lot to this shot. Personally, I think that we could probably crop out about half of that sky and end up with an image that is filled a little bit more with the purpose of the shot. If we look at the framing of this, almost half of the frame is taken up by that sky, yet that sky is not really adding to the story a lot. So by cropping out some of that sky and maybe just creating a little bit of a graduated effect, darkening the top portion of the sky and then letting it come back to this exposure would help draw the eye in to the bottom portion of the shot. Post-processing wise, I think it's fine. It's very tasteful. It's very tactful. You're not trying to create a bunch of saturation where there really shouldn't be any, and it's a good thing because this shot is about contrast, not saturation. Having said that, maybe you could get a little bit more bold with your contrast and make the difference in the in the dark rocks and the bright water, make those a little bit more impactful, and I think it'll make for a more impactful shot. So this shot is actually a nice example of shutter speed choice. Again, I really like the shutter speed that he chose for this shot because I love the way the water still has plenty of texture, but that movement is implied. I really like that. There's several different things in this shot that I like. I like the shutter speed choice. I love that beautiful fall foliage in the background. There's this nice sense of depth created by the fact that the water is so contrasty, yet there's that sense of atmosphere in the background. So there's a nice sense of depth. And I really like that one tree that is kind of, poking out a little bit further out into the frame, and it really gives an anchor for the shot. What I don't like, however, is just kind of the overall framing of the shot. Because we're including so much of the water and so little of that beautiful fall foliage, it makes the shot feel like it's all about the water when, to me, I feel like the foliage in the background is far more impactful and beautiful. And I would like to see more of that and less of the brown, dirty water, So for me, I would recompose this in a way to where the emphasis is a little bit more on the foliage and less on the water. It is a nice shutter speed choice, and I like that the vantage point is like from either a bridge or from inside the stream. I would just like the emphasis to be a bit more on the background and a bit more on all of that beautiful fall foliage we have going on. So this next image is from Dave, and it's a nice calm scene. I would say that this is one that I'm going to actually pick on. I feel like I'm talking about Shutterspeed a lot here. I'm sensing a theme, but I think I'm going to pick on the Shutterspeed choice for this. So if we look at the water in this particular shot, you notice how it's obviously a longer exposure, but it still has texture. I feel like this is an example of an awkward amount of texture. This is probably like a 10 to 15 second long exposure if I had to guess. It's long enough to where there's no ripples and there's no distinct shape to the water, but there's still texture. And in my opinion, it's an awkward amount of texture. So what I would like to see is this same exact shot, only with a distinctly long exposure where it's like a 2-minute long exposure and we're turning that water to absolute glass, or purposely speed up the shutter speed and try to maintain the shape of the ripples in the water, which in turn, by maintaining those shapes and ripples in the water, is going to reflect back that light that's happening. If we talk about composition, I feel like the composition works. You know, it's kind of an example of having static images next to a moving, water source. So you get that kind of sharp to soft contrast. But what I do and what I try to recommend is when we have a sky like this, where we have a really fiery sunset kind of lower on the horizon, but then it kind of peters out, you lose that cloud coverage as you get to the top of the frame. I would either try to zoom in a bit more and fill the frame with all of that beautiful color and eliminate kind of those cyan blues that are happening at the top, or maybe we'd just crop it out. So if we crop it out, something kind of like this, you can see that the frame is filled far more with the best stuff, and we're eliminating some of the lesser stuff. I think color temperature wise, it's a little bit on the cool side, so we could make it even a bit more fiery just by warming up that color temperature and really emphasizing the reds that are happening in the shot. Overall, I like the idea. I like the light that is happening for sure. I think that just by choosing a slightly different shutter speed, either purposefully fast or purposely slow, and then zooming in on the best portion of that light, the best portion of that sky, it's going to really maximize the impact that light is having on the shot. So this shot is actually kind of a good example of balancing a shot with interest. It doesn't always have to be with subject. So we have kind of a different type of composition here where we have distinct rock in the foreground, breaking the flow of the water as it recedes back. And we have this very distinct sea stack with this arch on the left, and it's way far off to the left side of the frame. But the reason it kind of works is because it's being balanced by all this nice light on the right side of the frame. So it's kind of creating a upside down triangle, if you will. In this shot, again, I feel like the sky, or at least the upper portion of the sky, is not really adding a lot to the shot. And I feel like there's maybe some post-processing things that we could do to keep the interest down low in the shot. So I brought this one into Photoshop. Let me show you what I'm thinking. So first of all, if we were just to crop down a bit on this shot, you can see that it kind of brings the interest down in the shot and it makes that sky a little bit less distracting. Another way that you can kind of achieve that is just by darkening the sky a bit. So if we just grab a simple brightness contrast adjustment layer, add a little contrast, decrease the brightness, and then just bring that in from the top portion of the shot, it's going to allow the eye to come down into the shot just a little bit more. So before, after. Remember, the eye is always going to be drawn to the brightest highlights, so it kind of makes sense. Also, when you have these really bright areas of sky, kind of like we do right here, we end up with these kind of harsh edges. One of the little tricks that I like to do for stuff like this is I'll either do this in Lightroom or in Adobe Camera Raw. I'll quickly create a merge visible layer. I'll go up to Adobe Camera Raw, and then inside Adobe Camera Raw, you can just grab a radial filter and we'll increase exposure, increase the warmth, and then decrease the dehaze. Make sure it's on the inside, make sure it's feathered. And then I'm just going to put this over our light source here. You can warm it up a bit more. All that's going to really do is mellow out those harsh edges that are happening around the light source. It's getting a little bit washed out, but you can counteract that with a little bit extra saturation in that radial filter. But that's just a little trick to kind of mellow out those harsh edges that sometimes you'll get around the really bright areas of the sky. And as I look at this, another thing that I'd be tempted to do is add a little bit of extra contrast to it. So if we do just a quick levels adjustment and maybe just grab layer mask and paint it quickly out of this sea stack so we're not getting too contrasty back here in this background. We don't want to block up these shadows. Just adding a little extra contrast to this shot. You can take it out of this area here. It's really going to help a little bit with that saturation. You could keep going with this. I'd like to see a little bit more contrast in this foreground as well. Paint it into this, and you can start to see how we're getting a whole lot more saturation going on in the foreground, a lot more texture, a lot more interest being brought down. If we look at the before, after, whole lot of difference in the amount of impact and interest. Obviously, all of this is subject to taste. You know, you don't have to go to the extremes that maybe I have, but you get the idea. I'd like to see the interest brought down out of that sky by cropping some of it out and then just mellowing out some of the highlights, and it'll help balance all of that interest to keep it very horizontal and keep it low in the frame. My biggest critiques here are going to be composition again. All of our interest obviously is going to be the firefalls over here. And because of its positioning off to the left side of the frame, it feels like an afterthought in the frame. And I'm not so sure that this composition works for me because the frame is being filled, 80% by things that are not really pertinent to the story. It's not, you didn't go to this particular spot on this particular day for 80% of this shot, everything off to the right here. You went there for everything that's happening over here. Do have some really nice light that's happening, but if we look at these areas here and zoom in on it, you can see that we are getting some haloing around this edge. So you want to be careful about the haloing as we're talking about the post-processing side of things, but really it's the composition that is bothering me on this shot. I would really like to see more of the frame filled with the reason you were there in the first place. And I don't think that it was for, the right 2/3 of the shot. I think it was for the left 1/3. I'm always trying to fill the frame with the point, the point of the shot. If you were to go home and tell the story of this particular morning, the only part of this shot that would probably even make it into that morning is going to be the sky and the firefalls that's happening there. So I feel like you should try to fill the frame a bit more with the action. But the post-processing is actually pretty nice. Just keep an eye on the halos you got going on there. Okay, so here we have a seascape, and this is kind of a common thing that I will see happen pretty often, especially if someone is using a graduated filter in the field. So I'd be interested to know, were you using grad filters when you shot this? I'm guessing yes. So what I'm talking about is we have some very bright water here in the foreground, and then we have jet black sea stacks. Our sky is getting over dark, and I can tell that it looks like it was all in one frame, but at the expense of all of this shadow information. I like the moment, I like the shutter speed, but what I don't like is the loss of shadow information. So what I would recommend to try to, salvage this shot is we need to balance the exposure from the top portion of the shot to the bottom. We need to try to salvage at least some shadow information here, and this portion of the sky is getting way, way over dark. So, just something as simple as a graduated filter boosting the shadows and boosting the exposure is going to help. Also, make sure that you're not over brightening some of the water in the bottom part of the shot. I would also highly recommend to not use graduated filters because they cause issues like this. It is nice to get it all in one shot. If you have to use a graduated filter, limit yourself at a 2-stop. This is obviously more than a 2-stop. This is probably more than a 3-stop, I would wager a guess. But limit yourself at a 2-stop soft and try not to use them when you have objects that are breaking the horizon line like this. Otherwise, the composition, the light is all really nice. The only thing that's really killing it is the over darkening of the sky and the over brightening of the foreground. So here's a beautiful shot from the Canadian Rockies, and I can feel how cold this morning must have been just by looking at it. Really nice subtle post-processing. I like the subtle post-processing. I love the panoramic perspective. There's a lot to really like about this. Really, my only critiques are going to be just a couple of small things. First of all, I personally would get rid of the coyote or rabbit tracks or whatever those are going through your foreground. I personally would rather see it as a nice, pristine, untouched landscape rather than those footprints. So I would personally get rid of those. Compositionally, panoramas can be pretty hard. We have quite a bit of open snow over here on the left, past the edge of this particular stream. And if we were to crop in here, we would end up losing these mountains over on the left. And I think that would be okay, because for me, the shot is all about, the strong lines that are being created in the river and our, mountains in the background here. I feel like we could probably crop in and have it be okay. I would also see if I could eliminate, and I'm not sure if this is going to show up here, but I would try to eliminate this dark edge that we're getting over on this. It's just kind of poking in just barely into the frame. It'd be really easy to clone that out. Yeah, otherwise, very beautiful shot, very tasteful post-processing. We have all our shadow information. It's looking really nice. I would just like to see those tracks gone, so we have that nice, clean, untouched snowscape, and then maybe just bringing in the left edge just a little bit, just to tighten the focus, tighten the perspective just a tiny bit. So here is a beautiful forest scene. Not the easiest subject to photograph. Usually the issues come with composition more than anything, and I think this is a good example of this. So first of all, beautiful conditions. I love the red ferns that we have down here. I love all of the mist in the shot. It's really giving that sense of, sense of atmosphere and depth like I talk about often. I also like the dodging and burning work that's been done. What I don't care for, however, is, well, first of all, the trail isn't ideal, but sometimes you can get away with that. But what I don't like really is all the sky intruding on this edge of the frame. It's unfortunate when the brightest part of the shot happens all the way over at the edge. You notice that this part of the sky is far brighter than even over here, where you would ideally want the eye to go. So I would highly recommend cropping in at least to this tree here, or just to the outside of the base of this tree. And one of the tricks that I have for getting rid of sky distraction like that is just using the clone tool in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this layer so I have some pixels to play with. Going to grab my clone stamp tool and change the blend mode to darken. By changing the clone tool to darken, it's going to only allow me to affect the brighter pixels in this area, which is going to happen to be all of that bright sky. So I've got my clone stamp mode changed to darken, and I'm just going to sample some of this bright foliage from over here, or bright background from over here, then go over to this area and clone over the top of it. That way, when I crop in on this shot, there's not going to be any of that bright sky distraction over here. The eye is going to come to the brighter portions of the shot. We could even darken down some of those brightest areas there, just with a simple brightness contrast adjustment layer and a luminosity mask targeting the brighter tones. We can put that inside of a group and paint that effect in. That way the eye is going to come deeper into the shot over here. Also, if we look on the ground over here, we see some really bright, almost blown out areas on that trail. And we can kind of deal with some of the distraction that happens from those bright highlights just by recovering those highlights. So I can start just by creating a brightness contrast adjustment layer, bringing down the brightness quite a bit, putting a black layer mask on it, then grabbing a Lights 1 luminosity mask, which is going to allow me to target just those brightest tones. Then with a 50% opacity brush, I'm just going to work that into this area down here. Maybe this area here, this area here. And all we've really done is, in a very selective way, recovered the highlights there. That way the eye is not going to go down to that path. Instead, it's going to come up into this area. We can even help that along by brightening up the shot just a little bit, putting a black layer mask on there, and directing the eye with brightness and luminance into this center section of the shot where we want the eye to go. The eye is always going to be drawn to those highlights, so you need to be in control over where those highlights live, and it helps composition. So if we go before and after, you can see I'm just trying to manage the visual path here. So before, we've got lots of bright highlights here, lots of bright highlights here, lots of bright highlights here, and then kind of low contrast in the center. And then after, I brightened up the mist in the center and recovered the highlights around the edge of the frame. Something we do have to be careful about is making sure that an area doesn't become oversaturated like that. So we might have to go in and manage how much we've done that effect. But you get the idea. It's all about managing where those highlights are going to live to help the visual path. But this is really a beautiful shot. I really love the conditions in this one. Just got to manage where those highlights are and direct the eye into the shot. All right, guys. So hopefully that was interesting to you. Image critiques can be useful even if they're not your images. And I know that I didn't get to very many, but we're going to continue to do this for as long as this COVID-19 thing is a thing and we're all stuck at home. We might as well be working on our own photography skill set, and I'll keep making these videos as long as you guys keep sending me images. So we'll start doing these every Wednesday. Hopefully this has been useful, and we'll catch you next time. Remember, if you haven't already sent me images, you can do so at sendnickphotos@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next video. Take it easy.